Okay, we're going to open God's Word. You should know where to look. Where are we? Acts chapter 2. And we're still at the end of this chapter, Acts chapter 2, verse 42 to 47, where we're looking to answer the question, what kind of community does the gospel create? Or what kind of community should the gospel create? And we've been thinking a little bit about that over recent weeks, and you probably won't remember, but if you do, at the start of this little section, at the end of Acts chapter 2, I did actually say that we're going to look at 10 priorities or 10 values that flow out of this passage. Well, I've adjusted it to 8, okay, you'll be pleased to know. So we're halfway through. So this week I'm going to look at 2, and then next week we'll look at 2 final ones as well that flow from this passage. And that will give us 8 easy to remember values that we should seek to fuel and live out in our own lives and in our church, even here in Rogerstone. And so far we've looked at, if you just knock the next slide up for me, here's a little prompt for you. So the priority of the word and prayer, we looked at in that first week, so being word-centered and being prayerful. And then last week we looked at the value of being relational and thankful. So value in relationships, we thought about fellowship and all that meant for them. And then being thankful, which was really rooted in this devotion to the breaking of bread and to sharing in this meal regularly in order to keep their minds and hearts focused on Jesus and grateful and thankful for him, because then everything flows out of that as well. So we thought about those 2 last week. This week, we're going to just focus on 2 more, generosity and hospitality. So being extravagantly generous and being hospitable. And next week we'll look at worship and mission, God willing. So let's just read this section again just to remind us as we think about these 2 values of generosity and hospitality. Okay, so from verse 42, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. Amen. Okay. So just 2 things to draw out, 2 values this week. So the first for this evening, which is actually value 5, but extravagantly generous. In verse 44 and 45 there, we've just read, it says that all the believers were together, had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Now that sounds pretty incredibly generous to me. But a bit further on in Acts, in chapter 4 actually, we read another description of this first church community that had blossomed up in the first century there, and it adds a little bit more to our understanding. So Acts chapter 4, let me just read that section to us. It says, all the believers were one in heart and mind. No one claimed that any of their possessions was their own, but they shared everything they had. With great power, the apostles continued to testify to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and God's grace was so powerfully at work in them all that there was no needy person among them. For from time to time, those who owned land or houses sold them, brought the money from the sales and put it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to anyone who had need. It's a dangerous passage for me to be studying at the moment when we're selling our house, isn't it? But clearly, when you read this, a radical shift had occurred in the minds and hearts of the believers in this first century context. Yeah, a radical shift. The way that they viewed their possessions, their property, their wealth, their resources had been radically transformed. And actually, the level of their generosity was such that Luke records there were no needy persons among them. They shared everything they had. They gave to anyone as they had need. And no one claimed that any of their possessions were their own. This is radical generosity and a radical way to think about our possessions and our wealth. Now, as I say, as we're looking at this, I'm not suggesting that we should all be selling up and giving away everything that we have. You'll be glad to know, okay? Obviously, if God is leading you to do things that are radical, then you should obey. But that's not what I'm kind of getting at here. But there are clearly some enduring principles that reveal a gospel-shaped heart and life that we can learn from, that we can reflect on as we read the example of this first century church. And what had happened here in this context in Acts is that these people, these believers, had come to a new understanding of God's grace, a new and wonderful understanding of God's grace. In Jesus, grace had invaded their lives, and grace was powerfully at work within them. And we see that right there in Acts chapter 4. Grace, remember, is undeserved favor. Yep, it's unmerited kindness. It's unearned blessing. Flows from the heart of God, not from anything that we deserve or achieve. And that's the gospel, is it not? This is the gospel that they'd come to know, that we've come to know, that we are saved by grace alone, through faith alone. This is not from ourselves. It is the gift of God so that no one can boast. This is grace. This is what we've come into, that realization and that reality. And these new converts, they now understood that all that they were, that all that they had, spiritually and practically, they had this new understanding and revelation that it all came from the generous heart and the generous hand of God. And that everything that they had been entrusted to them for the sake of the glory of God and for the good of others. And for the gospel of Christ. And they clearly had come into that realization and that revelation. And so they no longer, that's the reason they no longer regarded their possessions as their own. They held them loosely. They realized that they were stewards of what God had given, not owners. And so they were willing to lay down whatever God prompted them to lay down and use that for the sake of others to the glory of God. They'd come into a new revelation and realization of the grace of God and his work in their lives. And so grace is ultimately the foundation of generosity, of our generosity, of their generosity. And that foundation is built upon this idea that we are stewards. Yet we are not owners. We are stewards. Sometimes we like to think that we are owners and that all that we have is ours and only ours. That's wrong. As a Christian, you've come into a new realization. Oh, yeah, okay. I'm just a steward. Yeah, it's all his. So I'm supposed to be taking my lead from him with what he has given to me. That means we don't own anything, right? We don't own anything. We simply steward what we have been given, what we have been entrusted with by God. It's his, yeah. So we have to use it with that in mind. Psalm 24 verse 1 says, "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it." That's everything in it, including all that you have. Paul said to the Corinthians in his first letter, "What do you have that you did not receive? And if you did receive it, why do you boast as though you did not?" You know, and this mentality of, oh yeah, this is mine. I'm not my own kind of master. I'm my own success. No. All that you have has been given to you by God. I wonder how you view your possessions. I wonder how you view your money. I wonder how you view your resources. Do you view them as your own? To do with them what you want? And in that regard, do you hold them tightly? And do you use them merely for your own ends? Or do you actually view them in the right way as God's? For him to direct you to do with them what he wants or has designed or has purposed? I wonder. Because God does not want us to live selfishly. Yep. He doesn't want us to live selfish lives with the resources that He's given to us. He wants us to live open-handed and open-hearted, that we might be a blessing to those in need. And we often hear that phrase, we're blessed to be a blessing. But that's true, that's the heart of God. And so we have to keep that in mind as we navigate this life, particularly as those who have been entrusted with so much in our particular affluent context. And obviously there's different degrees of much, but we have plenty in our context. But we need to remember where that's all come from and why God has entrusted that to us. And of course, in our context, particularly as we're reflecting on the first church here in Acts, in our context, we might not need to sell houses or to sell our possessions in order to make sure that someone amongst us or someone that we know has a meal, every day, or has a roof over their heads. Because we actually live in a country where, and a time in history actually, where provision is available through other means, through government schemes, through housing associations, through charitable organizations. There's all sorts of things available to support people so that that weight is lifted off our shoulders and even off us as a church. But actually in the first century context, in terms of what we're reading about this evening, if you were poor and if you didn't have a family and if the church didn't help you, you'd have nothing. And so this is what we're reading. The church, this new family that had been birthed into, had to kind of put their faith into action in that respect in some radical ways, because they realized, wow, we're brothers and sisters here. We need to be, participating and helping. And we don't have that same kind of pressure because lots of other things are taken care of without us getting involved. So we're in a different context, okay? So we may not feel the same level of pressure or need all around us. However, what should gospel-birthed extravagant generosity, what should it look like in our context then? Very different context to the first century, but what should it look like? Because we are still supposed to be generous, radically generous people. So I just want to give us 5 quick things to think about in relation to generosity this evening. That will just help us, I think, as we continue to grow and seek to cultivate generous hearts. So 5 things to think about that will help us cultivate extravagant generosity more and more. Number 1, thanks Adam, we can meet local felt needs. As I've said, social housing and benefits and healthcare and all those kind of things that are often those things have kind of grown originally out of the church and out of Christians, but obviously they're taken care of. So that might mean we don't need to help people with some of those significant ongoing needs. However, people in our church, people in our community that God positions us amongst will still encounter many felt needs that our generosity can help with. Yep, we will see that and encounter that as we live our lives. So just an example, a new washing machine, for a single mum who is struggling to manage her family and to make ends meet. Just have that example in your mind, right? Very simple example, but that could be a very real and present need that our generosity, your generosity, could alleviate, even though, in the grand scheme of things and with all the chaos going on in our world and the hardship in our world, that may seem like, insignificant and irrelevant. It's a first world problem, a washing machine. However, for that single mum, that can make a major difference to her life and actually relieve a whole lot of anxiety and a whole lot of stress, and can be a demonstration of the grace of God and the generosity that He calls us to live by. So simple things like that. That's what I'm talking about by a felt need. Yep, in the grand scheme of things, not a massive deal, is it? But it's a way of us demonstrating generosity. And we have to live life in the context where we are. We have to live with the realities of life that face us in our society. And those realities bring up very real and very difficult and needy situations whereby we have been positioned to extend grace. Yep, so we have to have our hearts open and ready for that. And there are actually many people who do still feel powerless and helpless, even in our society, when there is so much support all around. There are people like that who feel powerless and helpless. And again, that can be situations of their own making, or it could be things that are out of their control. But either way, we can and should be ready to act and to help the helpless where God brings them across our path, whether that's the homeless, the addicted, the infirm, the lonely, or whatever and wherever. And we need to walk with our eyes open and our hands open. And if we do that, we will discover and find places where our generosity can find expression and should find expression. And of course, we have to do that with wisdom. And I'm sure we all understand that you have to be wise in the way that you express your generosity. So obviously giving, if you're thinking of a homeless ex-addict or someone, giving them food, a sleeping bag, something that's going to help them in a practical way is obviously going to be better than giving them money, which the temptation will then be for them to use it on fueling their addiction. So we exercise wisdom, but we have opportunity to demonstrate generosity. And so it's about cultivating a heart that sees and responds to people's need. And we should practice that kind of generosity in the place and amongst the people where God has positioned us. So we can meet felt local needs. All right? So let's keep our eyes and our hearts open. Number 2, and remember we're talking about cultivating an extravagant generosity as individuals and as a church. We can meet global gospel needs. We can meet global gospel needs. So we can give to things that reflect God's heart and serve the extension of his kingdom outside of our immediate context. Yep, so we don't only have to think locally, we should think globally. The needs around the world are desperate and ongoing, and it is easy for us, being so far removed at times, to shut our eyes to it, to keep it at a distance, to not do anything to help, because it's easy to think also that what can we do to help? What's my little donation going to do? What's my little gift each month going to do? And we can kind of think, just leave it to somebody else because it's not going to make any difference, and we ignore needs that God has positioned us to help with. And of course, in giving to the local church, which again we should do as part of our expression as Christians, as we give to the local church, we get to play a part in what the local church does with its resource, for the sake of the mission. So as a church, right now we currently are able to support Open Doors with a monthly donation, also Compassion, and a child sponsorship program. We've also this week been able to give a donation to Pastor Bob for the ongoing work in Pakistan, which he came to share about in January. And obviously we can and will do these kind of things more and more. So we are able as a local church to give into global needs. But I would also encourage you individually to think about how you can extend your own personal giving in relation to global gospel needs. Sometimes when we are thinking about it personally and acting upon it individually, that can help in terms of what God does in our hearts as well as what we're able to give into the work that he is doing. And so I'd encourage you to think about that. Find some reputable Christian aid organization or Christian charity or mission society to regularly give to, so that you are sowing into the gospel global mission. And again, Open Doors, we use a lot. That's a great organization to sow into. Compassion International, Wycliffe Bible Translators, even national projects like Christians Against Poverty or Care for the Family, things that are, trying to show and share God's heart and God's wisdom in our world. You'll have your own things, talk about it together, but we should give to global gospel needs and get used to giving. This is a way of life. It should be a way of life for us. We should practice the joy of giving repeatedly and regularly. We should hold our positions and our wealth lightly. We should use what God gives to us to strengthen his global mission. That should be part of our ongoing work and our responsibility. And so and we should want to do that. We should delight in that. It is better to give than to receive. So think about that. So think of local felt needs, but also think global gospel needs. So those are 2 things. Number 3, we can pray for opportunities to be generous. We can pray for opportunities to be generous. I don't know if you are. Are you praying for opportunities? Sometimes perhaps we don't want to because we don't want God to prompt or stir our hearts. But are you praying about how God wants you to use all that he is given to you? How often do you pray? And as I say, sometimes it's dangerous to pray that or to pray those kind of prayers because God might just answer and give you something to do. Something that you hadn't planned on giving, but that he wants you to. I remember a silly example, but I remember saving up for an iPad. And after receiving some birthday money, I'd finally got to the desired amount to get me a nice new iPad. But then in my desire to live open-handed and open-hearted, I felt God kind of prompted me to give that money to a special offering that we had at church. And so I did, and I had to wait a little longer for my iPad. But what I'm showing through that and what I want to live and what I want us to live is like, hey, it's not mine anyway. You know, even if I have spent quite a lot of time saving up for something I want, still not mine, it's God's. And he needs to have permission to say, hold on a minute, yeah, I've got a better use for that right now. And we have to trust. God always knows what we need. We don't go without as we serve God. But it is more blessed to give than to receive, and we need to demonstrate that in the way that we hold on to things and use our resources and our finances. And so are we bringing all of our finances into continual submission to God? Or are there pots of money that we tell God, whether that's consciously or subconsciously, but we say to him, keep your hands off that, God? I wonder. Do you remember the rich young ruler and his interaction with Jesus? You can read about that in Matthew chapter 19. But you know, he walked away from Jesus sad, the text tells us. He walked away sad because he had great wealth. And Jesus had actually, in his dialogue, had put his finger on that idol of money and wealth. And so Jesus had said, look, sell up, give to the poor, and then come and follow me. But the rich young man couldn't do it. He couldn't do it because he loved his wealth and his stuff more than Jesus. And we've got to be careful that that can't be said about us. Do we love our stuff more than we love Jesus? Yep, Jesus is our treasure. So whatever he wants, then let's let him have it. Yep, no better way to live. It's a heart issue. It's an ownership issue. It's a treasure issue. Where's your true treasure? Is it stuff? Is it money? Or is it Jesus and all that you have in him and will continue to have in him? So we need to seek God for opportunities to be generous, and we need to submit all things to him. So pray for opportunities. We can do that. If we want to cultivate extravagant generosity, we need to do that. Number 4, we can regularly reassess our expenditure. We can regularly reassess our expenditure. I wonder what your bank statement would say about your true treasure. Yeah? What would your bank statement say about the way you steward what God gives to you? Would it look like God is Lord of your life and your finances? Or would it suggest that someone or something else is? And these are important questions for us to ask individually, or as couples or as a family. What would your bank statement say about your true treasure? And in the church, and we hear a lot about this, don't we? The principle of tithing, or the 10%, giving 10% of our income through the local church. And that is an Old Testament regulation, okay? So we're not bound by it in the same way that they were. However, you've probably heard it kind of taught and encouraged, and it can be a helpful principle for us. We've found it, helpful over the years. But it's a platform, it's not a ceiling, It's like... So this practice of the tithe can be helpful, although we're not bound by it. As New Testament believers, actually our giving should be motivated by grace. So it should go way beyond the tithe, way beyond the law. Yeah, we're grace givers. However, what often happens, and what I've seen often happen, is that the tithe becomes a thing that we kind of religiously tick off. If we follow that practice, we tick it off, and then it's like we've ticked that, so we can use the rest of our income however we want. And that's how often it plays out. It's like, so, okay, here's what you get, God, 10%. And now the 90%, right, That's mine. Keep your hands off. You've had yours. I get to do what I want with it. And we kind of disengage our brains and our hearts from the way that we use all that God has given to us. You see, the tithe, the 10% principle was always intended as a symbolic expression of the reality that it is all yours, God. And here's the first fruits as a demonstration, as a recognition of that fact. It wasn't supposed to be, oh, there you go, there's yours, the rest is mine. It was like, God, this is all yours, so I'm going to give you the first as a priority because I believe and I know that it's all yours. But we still have to submit everything that we have to God's will and God's purpose. We need to live like we believe it's all God's. He gets the first fruits, yes, that's a priority, but also we're thankful for the rest. It helps us pay our bills, it helps us bless our families, it helps us enjoy some things in life, and we're grateful for all of that. But we have to live open-handed and open-hearted with all that God has given, because we're stewards, not owners. We're stewards, not owners. We don't get to tell God to keep his hands off any of it. We can't. It's his. We use it as he desires. So take time to assess and evaluate your expenditure. Consider where you are reflecting the central place that God has in your life through the way that you use money. And I know all of us will be in different situations and contexts, and so we have to pay attention to all of that. You know, for some of us, this is much simpler. You know, if you're in a situation, you're married, and you're kind of both aligned on that, much easier. If you're not, I get that. It's going to be difficult. But still think about what you can do to make sure that you are reflecting the heart that God has called you to live with in regards generosity. There is always more we can reflect on. There's always more that we can do. There's always more that we can use for the sake of God's glory and his kingdom. So you can reassess expenditure. And number 5, we can have money available to give. We can have money available to give. What I mean by that is we can be intentional, or we should be intentional, in seeking to increase our capacity and our capability to give. Increase our capacity and our capability to give. So have money available to meet other people's needs so that you can express the generous heart of God as situations arise. Yep, as they come up, as they crop up. So in other words, what I'm saying is we need to learn to live within our means. Learn to live within your means as far as possible. And again, I know that we're all in different situations, but if you live within your means, if there's margin in your finance, then that means you are able to give when opportunity presents itself. Because otherwise we can be willing, we can want to be generous, but if we've not prepared well enough to be able to give, then we won't be able to do so when we have opportunity. My grandpa and grandma, they used to, share with us about their kind of giving, but they had a pot of money which they called the Lord's Fund. Now, I know, as I've been saying, it's all the Lord's, okay, and they knew that as well, but it was just a helpful way of, marking this particular pot that they would keep aside. So they called it the Lord's Fund, and this was in addition to what they would give regularly to the church, and they were missionaries overseas, what they would sow into global mission. So this is in addition to that. They had a pot called the Lord's Fund, which they deliberately had to one side, and they would put extra money in there, in that pot, so that, one, it was ring-fenced and it didn't get frittered away because they'd put some extra in the Lord's Fund. But that meant that when any needs kind of emerged or presented themselves, they'd already prepared themselves to be able to respond and to be able to give and to be able to be generous to help those in need, because they'd already thought about it and planned for it. And so they were able to bless. And we have found that a super helpful thing, such a simple thing, but we have found that super helpful to, in addition to all the giving that we are doing regularly, to have some set aside in what's called the Lord's Fund, so that we are ready and able to respond when needs emerge, and we get the privilege of blessing others and giving to others because we've already prepared to do that. And so what I'm saying is, don't overstretch yourself financially so that you've got no margin, but actually create margin and then prepare for spontaneous giving. Sounds funny, doesn't it, to plan for spontaneity, but you can in relation to giving. Prepare for it, have it aside, and then when something spontaneously comes up, let me help you, let me bless you, let me be generous towards you. And you'll get the joy of giving over and over and over again. And remember, God is interested in the heart, not how much you give, but your heart to give. And so make sure that the desire within you is matched by your actions. Again, with whatever situation you find yourself in, we mustn't claim to be generous and then do nothing to cultivate a more generous life. Yep. So position yourself practically and financially for generosity. And we obviously want to be an extravagantly generous church. Yep. That's the kind of church we want to be part of, and we all get to play our part in that. And again, how encouraging was it? As I shared last week, the news that River Church have committed to such radical generosity in sowing into this church for the sake, obviously, of my salary and stuff. But they've, God's prompted that. They'd prepared for that by setting aside income in their annual finances, and then they've allowed God to lead them and stir them to be able to give that. But obviously we're recipients, obviously myself directly and Sarah, but us as a church are the beneficiaries of what they have been willing to do and what they have prepared to. And we want to express that kind of heart as a church ourselves. Not in the same way, we're not going to do the same thing, but we want to prepare to be generous and cultivate that kind of generosity as a church. And so we're going to do that more and more. As I said, we're already setting aside a tithe on our income as a church, and I'm sure that will grow in the years ahead, but we will get to give and be generous in a planned way, but also in a spontaneous way. So, 5 things. And again, maybe some will resonate with you more than others, but if you just take these 5, these things will help you cultivate a heart of extravagant generosity. We can meet local felt needs. We can meet global gospel needs. We can pray for opportunities to be generous. We can regularly reassess our expenditure, and we can have money available to give. And as we do that, individually and corporately, we will grow in our generosity. Okay, value 6, just quickly, and then I'll wrap this up. I ain't going to spend long on this one at all, but value 6, this value of hospitality or being hospitable. And we read in verse 46, it says, every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts. And so I'm seeing in here this expression of hospitality. And that's about generosity as well. It's about generosity of heart and life. It's about sharing and welcoming and accepting people into our lives and into our families and into our homes and into our church. And it's about taking the initiative in befriending and caring for others and helping people feel that sense of belonging. Yeah? And it ties closely with what we thought about last week in regards to fellowship and value in relationships. But this value of hospitality is a biblical value. It's a biblical theme. We can see it mentioned in other parts of the New Testament. So 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 8 to 10, Peter says this, above all, love each other deeply, because love covers over a multitude of sins. Offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. Each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. There's that word, steward, then. Again, not owner, but steward of all that God gives. And actually, I find it significant that hospitality here in this passage in 1 Peter chapter 4 is found in the context of love and serving. That's what he's talking about. And actually, that sums it up quite nicely. It's loving and serving one another. That's what being hospitable is. That's what hospitality involves. It's about being generous to one another in opening up your lives, in opening up your home, in welcoming people into the spaces and the places that you inhabit. Romans chapter 12, verse 13. Share with God's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. And one of the primary metaphors for the church is family. It's family. The Bible's history actually is a history of family. From the Old Testament through to the New Testament, God's people are presented as being more like a family than an institution. Yep, that's the kind of sense we get. That's the language we get. Adam and Eve, Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, the household of faith, the children of Abraham, the brothers and sisters in Christ. Yep, God's people are family. And so we should be passionate about cultivating the family atmosphere and value in our church. And one of the main gifts and practices that can ensure that that happens is that of hospitality. Hospitality. And I think just 2 areas to think about in this regard. 2 areas. Home hospitality and Sunday corporate hospitality. So as a church, corporately, but also in our homes. So inviting people into your home. Now, This can be a powerful tool in building community. That sends a message. It did in the Bible times, it still does today, I think. It sends a message, an undeniable message, that you're genuinely interested in others, that you value them, that you accept them, that you care for them. Because they're welcome in your home. And I know, again, that's not easy. We've all got different contexts and different situations and different homes and houses, so it's not going to be, that's not going to be something that we're all doing regularly. But some of us will, and some of us should be. And we want that, I think, as a church, as Christians. We want a culture of openness and hospitality as a church, because this is really important and foundational to community and to relationships. And I'll say this on this, and this is often a challenge that we face ourselves, but in regards to hospitality, and again, some people will be more natural at this than others, but often what happens is we end up dismissing our ability to be hospitable at home, I'm talking about, and it's an issue of pride and performance that prevents us kind of using what God's given to us or taking that step. It's pride or performance. What do I mean? I mean that we think that we have to be a good cook or have a nice home in order to invite people or to welcome people in. Otherwise, what are they going to think of us? My cooking's not that great. My home's not that tidy at times, a little, and so we can dismiss the idea, but that's just pride. We're just thinking about our own reputation and what other people will think of us, but actually, hospitality is not about reputation. It's not about cooking and cleaning. It's about relationship and connection. That's what hospitality is. That's what you're trying to foster. And so we need to get over those barriers. I'm not saying there won't be barriers that are there, but I'm saying those ones, we've got to get over that and say, hold on, how can we foster relationships in a way that builds community by using our own homes to offer hospitality and to welcome people into them. So that's just something to think about. But this second one, number 2, Sunday hospitality, this is something that we can all participate in. We may have different thoughts about the home one. This one we definitely can and should all be participating in. So our Sunday gathering, our Sunday meetings or other meetings that we will have here or as a church, these are supposed to be, let me say, should be regarded as your very own home. Where you have found a place of belonging and family. And you are actually inviting other people into that place to join your extended family for whatever it is, a couple of hours on a Sunday evening or at other times in the week. The family is coming together. Church is family. The family is coming together, and it welcomes new faces, and it welcomes new members. That should be our heart. And I would say this, if every one of us has the attitude, this is my home, these are my guests, then actually everything would fall into place very nicely. Because we will all take responsibility. And I think we do this really well, and I'll say that again in a moment. But think about it. If someone came to your home, you wouldn't just ignore them. You'd have a sense of responsibility, right? You'd go out of your way. You'd make an effort to make them feel at home, to make them feel welcome. You'd engage in conversation. You'd show an interest in them. It's your home, after all. So you would take responsibility to make sure that people feel welcome. Well, this is your home too. I want that thinking to come alive in you. This is your home. And this is your family. And so each of us need to take responsibility in terms of how we make people feel welcome and how we interact in our home. We look out for people. We talk to people. We don't just think someone else is going to take care of it. We don't just think, that's Martin and Sarah's home or Martin and Sarah's church. They can sort all that out, all that hospitality business. That's not how it works. We all have a part to play in our family, in our church, and in making others feel welcome. And as I say, I think we do a great job on this. I really do. I think we do all take responsibility. There is a sense of this being home and us all playing a part and taking responsibility. So thank you for that, And I want to encourage you. Don't, keep going, Keep growing that aspect of our life together. Keep learning. Keep making an effort in this area to make this a welcoming place where people can come through and be made to feel at home because of the greeting that they are met with, and because of the conversations that they have, and because of the tea and coffee that they're served, and just because of the way that they're loved, yeah, and made to feel valued, and people taking an interest. Last week we had two of our friends come from Bridge Church. We didn't know they were coming, and they turned up early, but how great it was for us just to see members of this church just going straight up to them, saying hello, you know, taking an interest in them, welcoming them, and after as well, having good conversations in the coffee area. You know, so as I say, we do this well, but I just want to keep encouraging us, yeah, to keep having that right mentality and saying, yes, we're part of this, and so we can continue to grow this value in our church so that others are blessed by it. So, let's continue to become the kind of church that is both generous in helping others with the resources that we've been given, so extravagantly generous, but also generous in welcoming others into the family that we've been given as a church as well. So they're both kind of generosity being expressed, but generous and hospitable. I hope that encourages you, and I hope that gives you food for thought as well in terms of working some of this stuff out in the days, weeks, and months ahead. Let me pray for us as individuals and as a church, and then we're going to close our time with worship and enjoy some tea and coffee and connection, fellowship together. Let's pray.